record these videos in clusters, so if you're tired of seeing the Spirit Adrift shirts, I apologize. Trust me, I'm tired of wearing it. I feel like a Viking. I feel like I'm on a raid. I'm raiding across the lands. I'm sweaty, I'm tired, and we have a band to talk about that is certainly worth the blood, the sweat, the tears, and everything. We have Enslaved. Enslaved is a group that has certainly been a very big mind-boggler for a lot of people. Starting off as a Viking metal band or a black metal band, and then slowly but surely transitioning their sound to include more progressive, more heathen tendencies. This is a group that has certainly transcended what they initially started as in order to become more. And as a result, their long discography is oftentimes praised by the heavy metal universe, and Enslaved is now a name that if you happen to be into the genre, you're absolutely going to know, and if you don't, you certainly should know. But as a result, it also means that we have a lot of albums to talk about. We have a basket full of albums that we need to talk about, and we're going to do that today, because today we are going to rank them all. Now, obviously, our lists are going to differ very, very greatly, so while I am telling you mine, please, in the comments below, I invite you to tell me yours. So it's time for us to rank them all, Enslaved, 1 to 14, and no doubt more albums to come. Let's start with number 14. Number 14 is Vikingligers Veldi. This is an album that is not necessarily bad. In fact, I'm going to be the first one to tell you that there is no wrong decision whenever it comes to Enslaved. It's one of those bands. Literally any place that you start, you're going to find something that is going to be very, very acceptable. If you happen to be a fan of black metal, heathen metal, Viking metal, progressive metal, they do it all. This one is a little bit more in the heathen variety. This one's a little bit more in the epic variety. So that may turn off some people that like the newer stuff. But at the same time, I don't think so. I think this is an album that has a great epic feel. But at the same time, it's one that is kind of from the more forgotten part of their discography, the more forgotten part of their career. Maybe needs a little bit of a revitalization. So check it out and maybe do that. Number 13 is Mardum, Beyond the Within. It's actually sort of the same problem. It's actually sort of just the same problem. Not a bad album whatsoever. Very well designed riffs, very well designed atmospheres. It's just from an element or a part of their career that is not talked about all that much. And these guys were really, really solid in the 1990s, going into the new millennium. They had great material that certainly took the Viking metal genre to a higher place, perhaps without even most people realizing it. You know, you had Bathory that was being the clear-cut winner, but then you had a band like Enslaved that was coming in and was kind of keeping the whole foundation solid. And they were doing it from a very, very young age as a band. Number 12 is Vertebrae. This one is an interesting one, considering I like this album, but at the same time, it's one that comes off in this modern era as a little bit more of the forgettable child, the one that doesn't exactly resonate with your memory and stay there quite as long as some of the other classics that we have gotten delivered from Enslaved over the past 15 to 20 years. And that's not necessarily a knock on this album. It's just the one that felt like, as they were slowly progressive and tweaking their sound more and more, that Vertebrae just was the one experiment or the one tweak that didn't quite hold up quite as well. It was the one that didn't quite have as much as that length of response or length of memory. And as a result, we have an album that's filled with solid enough material, however, just one that needed a little bit of something extra in order to propel it into the elite category. Number 11 is Eld. This is a masterpiece. It is actually a really, really solid album. Many people that love the old Enslaved sound absolutely praise this album and beloved it. However, this is one that, once again, even with that being said, is kind of forgotten by some of the newbies and needs to be revisited and re-listened to for them to understand where this band came from. You get a lot of where their initial inception, an initial view, an initial everything came from with this disc, and it's one that is quite wonderful. Number 10 is Run. And Run we did. We ran out to scope out this album, I did at least, considering what I had heard with albums that had preceded it, albums such as Below the Lights, which we will talk about very, very soon. It is a fantastic disc and one that certainly has lasted the test of time. However, it's another album that sort of suffers Vertebrae's fate, where perhaps the evolution between its procedure, and it was not necessarily as large of a jump as perhaps we were expecting, or perhaps not as large now that we're able to look at it from a retrospective standpoint and examine how the sound has indeed morphed. Number 9 is In Times, and this is a recent Enslaved album, and one that doesn't suffer from the similar fate of Run, but instead feels like this was 2010 Enslaved on autopilot, 2010's Enslaved on autopilot, should I say. They were really able to make some leaps at the tail end of the 2000s. They were able to enhance that in 2010s. However, this was a disc that felt like it was on the cusp of something, but they just didn't quite go all in with the idea. And of course, as we learned, they eventually did go all in with the idea of going big, but we just didn't get it on this album. Still a really strong disc, but still not quite what we needed at the time. Number 8 is Isa, and this was a somewhat fitting follow-up to Below the Lights. This was a somewhat fitting album to follow up what we were able to get from what I consider to be kind of a hidden masterpiece. This is one that definitely continued that morphology that we saw with Below the Lights and a couple of the albums that preceded it, including Monumention, and it just gave the whole entire idea a real nice sort of jump leap, and it gave it a partner album. It showed that Below the Lights and these other discs were not just a part of a shortened era that was then going to dissolve and return back to where the band had come from. It was instead going to be an enhancement portion for the band. It was something that was going to be added to the sound and continue their sonic journey through the stars or through the heavens or to Valhalla or, I don't know, to the beer store. Who knows? Wherever they were heading, this is an album that helped them head there, considering now they were able to do a combined effort with all of the different sounds that they had collected over the past 5 to 6 years and 4 albums, roughly, in order to create a disc that was a bit of a nice little witch's brew of everything, but not necessarily the perfectly crafted one. Number 7 is Frost, yet another classic album in Enslaved's early discography. If Eld is not the one that is talked about by the heathen metal or the Viking metal aficionados, then it is certainly Frost. And this is a disc that certainly has that atmosphere to it. It's very cold, it's very dank. It is certainly one that has all of those aspects. And this is one where the fine-tuning and the tweaking of the earliest days of this band certainly were coming together, and they were coming together very nicely. And it was presented in a fashion that, while it sounded a little bit more black metal along with the heathen side, which is certainly part of Enslaved sound, it was one that was nicely self-contained also. This is a disc that feels a bit unique in their catalog as a result of that, and because of that, I think is why it gets its semi-legendary status among those who are elite in, I guess, heathen metal? Let's go with that. Number 6 is Gratir. This is another recent album, and one that certainly showed the band in the 2010s, pushing the boundaries, but doing it just little by little. The best way that I could compare this is with Amorphous. I call Amorphous one of the most consistent bands in heavy metal, because all of their albums do have a very similar vibe to them, but all of their albums have just a little minor tweak that makes them all feel different and unique and very self-contained. That's what Gratir was able to do. That's what this album was able to accomplish. It sounded a lot similar to what we were getting from the band in recent memory, but it had a little bit of a different little twinge to it. Perhaps it was how a song was designed here. Perhaps it was the way in which the tracks were flowing based around the track listing there. Perhaps it was just the overall body of work, the way in which this album was delivered to us. It's just a disc that is a weird paradox, I guess. It was one that certainly pushed the band forward while not setting them too far back. Number 5 is Bloodhem. This is a forgotten album that needs to be re-explored almost immediately, because this is a really dark and subtly genius record that was very much initiation to the changes that were about to come whenever it came to Enslaved and their sound. It was definitely an album that helped to start introducing some of the more progressive or some of the darker elements. It showed them as a band that was now willing to explore, and they were going to do things that was not necessarily what was expected. They weren't going to play by the rules or paint by number. Instead, they were going to traverse their own course. They were going to become their own Vincent van Gogh or their own Bathory. So instead of simply inventing a sound and replicating it, they were instead going to enhance that. And they were going to give it a little bit more. Kind of like how a band such as Bathory was able to expand from their beginnings all the way up into the Nordland series. Sort of the way in which a band such as Opeth was able to start off with a little bit more of a heavier vein and a little bit more of that prog death epicness, and then we're able to really make that a little bit more of a really containable but also expandable principle. Kind of like how Edge of Sanity's Crimson told us that there were no limitations whenever it came to time and length and epic scope whenever it came to the concept of death metal. This is an album that has that similar philosophy, not to mention also that similar vein. The only thing it doesn't boast, which is unfortunate by the way, is a similar reputation. Number 4 is Below the Lights. This was my first Enslaved album. I'll be the first to admit that, and this was a mind trip. Whenever I heard about this band, whenever I read up and saw everything about them, whenever I was much, much younger, I was in fact in, I think, my second year of college, I thought to myself, this is going to be pretty interesting. I figured straightforward black metal. I listened to the album, and I was curious with what I heard. I heard elements of progression. I heard elements of Viking and heathen metal. I heard black metal, but it wasn't like the black metal that I had heard beforehand. It reminded me a little bit more of an evolution of Emperor after, Prometheus, as opposed to being, the Immortals or the Dark Thrones of the world. And I liked what I heard. I liked what this album was able to present. It was one that gave riffs that could actually be seen as really, toe-tappy. Very much like you were in a heathen horde and you were singing a song as you were heading on your way to a slaughter, but at the same time also have very powerful tracks. There's a 9-minute long epic on here. So they showed me with this album that their sky was the limit, that they had absolutely no rules and they were going to do whatever they wanted. And I respected that and became a fan instantaneously because of it. Number 3 is Monumention, and this is a monumental album, because this was the disc that showed to heavy metal fans that Enslaved was indeed not going to paint by number. This is one that is almost a mindfuck in some locations. It's a trip. It's one that does not have very many self-containing rules. There's still a lot of the black metal. There's still a lot of the sounds present that you heard on elder albums such as Frost or Eld or things of that variety. But now we also had more density. Now we also had some very progressive or almost space metal or space rock additions to it. They gave us more, and it was something that perhaps at first was not necessarily either well received or it was kind of confusing to some folks. But as time moves on, it becomes the legendary status that it now is, at least to me. I mean, I love this album. I think this album is one of the best discs that this band has been able to produce, and it's because they stepped outside of the circle, similar to what they did with Bloodhound, but they did it in a different way. They showed that they could be an unpredictable group, and I like that. I respect that. This was an experiment that became a culture, that became a band lifestyle, and it's something that we have been really reaping the benefits of ever since its release. Number 2, Axima Ethica Odine, the first ever album of the year on the coverkillernation channel. This album is epic in scope. This album is fantastic. It has terrific production, and yes, it is affected a little bit by the loudness wars, which makes it extremely sound dense and extremely layered. But as a result, this actually gives everything that Enslaved is doing on this disc a lot more power and register. It gives it a lot more oomph. It actually kicks you in the balls, as it's supposed to do, as opposed to having that sort of distant feel to it. Sometimes black metal needs to have a little bit of that extra oomph that is offered by modern production. And this was an album that certainly was worthwhile in that venture, and it still wasn't one that was nearly as densely layered as some of the others that we had heard. Man, some of them are extremely obnoxious whenever it comes to that. But added along to that, the material was absolutely fantastic. You had a great opener and a great closer. You had great self-contained songs that were right there in the middle. It's an album that flowed absolutely exquisitely. You didn't want to stop listening to it. You didn't want to cut back from it. You don't want to take a break from it. You want to start it, you want to finish it, you want to listen to it, you want to love it, and then you just do. That's exactly what happens with this album. It's absolutely terrific. Would I vote it as Album of the Year again? I probably would, despite the fact that I've probably heard 3,000 more albums from that year ever since. Who cares? Number 1, E. That's right. For one of these lists, the number 1 album is the most recent one. It's mind-blowing. It's absolutely mind-blowing. I don't know if this has happened before. I really don't, but let's talk about it. All through this list, what have we discussed? We discussed about how Enslaved was a band that was willing to morph. They were a band that was willing to take risks. They were a group that was able to incorporate 4 or 5 different supposed subgenres of heavy metal in order to make it their own. They concocted the ultimate witch's brew. And then what do they do with E? They go folky on us. Not necessarily folky like Simon and Garfunkel, but they go back to the homeland. They go back to the Viking or the warrior's way. They go back to flowing rivers, dense forests, brave warriors, nature, and they do it in such a way that it becomes one of the most beautiful and unexpected releases that we got last year. This was a tremendous, tremendous disc. One that is such a pleasant re-listen to this very day that I am very, very surprised that not all of you have purchased this on the CK and Amazon page, because it is wonderful and luscious. This is one that took all of those different ideas that were coming together and didn't necessarily throw them out the window, but took a little break from them for a little bit, and then where it was able to redesign and reinvent the wheel once again. You know, perhaps Enslaved was listening to the fact that in their 2010s material, they were starting to sound a little bit like they were on autopilot, and decided, autopilot no more. We want to experiment once again, or perhaps one last time. This is a band that morphed. This is a band that hit us with a huge surprise. It was one that whenever I went to listen to it, I was excited, but I wasn't as excited as I had been in the past. I thought to myself, this will probably be decent enough, but this will probably also be an album that will sound very similar in vein to the last few. I was pleasantly surprised. I was wonderfully surprised. This album was very high on the Album of the Year list. I think it came in at either number 2 or number 3. And still to this day, I enjoy popping this disc in whenever I'm going on a car ride and just immersing myself in the music that is contained within. And that's why it's number 1. Not just because it's new, not because it's fresh in the memory, but because this is an album that was very similar to what Monumention did. It's very similar to what Below the Lights did for me. It's very similar to what perhaps Frost or L did for heathen metal fans. It took me on a ride. It surprised me. It captivated me. It kept me involved. And I love it and I want more. I hope the next album is not quite like E, but I want it the same vein. I want it to go more. I want to go further. Combine E with Monumention. Do it. I challenge you, if you're listening to this, Enslaved, combine E with Monumention and make Mon E Mention. I think it'd be amazing. But I want to know what you guys think about the list. I also hope that your lists are done. I've given you plenty of time. Let me know in the comments below also what your favorite moment of Enslaved is, or wow, what more is there really to say? I'll tell you what there is to say. If Enslaved has ever inspired you or made you want to become a guitar player, top link in the description box. Wait for you to do that. That's all I can say. I'm spent. I'm coverkillernation also. I'll talk to you guys all next time, and I leave you with the final thought of, go listen to some freaking Enslaved. These guys are amazing.